It was shortly after World War II, and Cuba had recently gained independence from Spanish rule. Their leader, Fulgencio Batista, was considered by many to be the savior of Cuba. On March 10, 1952, just before elections, Batista, with military backing, staged a coup to maintain power. The U.S. government expressed its content with this new government. Meanwhile, poverty on the island was growing. In 1953, the average Cuban family had an income of $6 a week, and the labor force was chronically unemployed. It was during this time that a young political activist named Fidel Castro began conspiring to overthrow Batista. Together with Argentine leader Che Guevara, he used guerrilla tactics to wear down Batista's forces. Eventually, Batista was forced to flee Cuba. Castro was sworn in as prime minister in February 1959. He implemented far-reaching reforms by nationalizing factories and plantations in an attempt to end U.S. economic dominance. He continued by signing the first agrarian reform law, which limited the size of landholdings, intending to develop a class of independent farmers. In 1960, Castro began establishing relations with Communist Russia. America responded with sugar sanctions, and Eisenhower broke off all diplomatic relations. On April 16th of that year, Castro formally declared Cuba a socialist state. The following day, 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in an attempt to overthrow Castro's regime. The invasion failed, with many dead and captured. On February 7, 1962, the U.S. imposed a full economic embargo on Cuba, a policy that continues to this day. Within the country, civil liberties were whittled away as labor unions lost the right to strike, independent newspapers were shut down, and religious institutions were harassed. Castro removed all opposition to his rule through executions and imprisonments. He was target of countless CIA assassination attempts throughout the years, including exploding cigars and fungus-infected scuba diving suits. Castro was reported as saying that if avoiding assassination attempts was an Olympic sport, he would have won gold medals. We notice a similar story in Chile. In 1964, the U.S. funded the campaign of Frey and the Christian Democrats with over $8 million to ensure a victory. Toward the end of Frey's rule, Popular Unity, a coalition of socialist states, began to form against Frey. The 1970s elections came closer, and the UP selected Salvador Allende as its candidate. Allende barely won, but his socialist plans were quickly made known. He nationalized hundreds of businesses in order to intervene, as his party put it. Capital flight ensued as investors in Chile feared that the inflation would only get worse, and the socialist reforms would fail. The U.S. worried that Chile would become, as Nixon said, another Cuba, and he thought the best way to deal with it was to make the economy scream, he said. Allende maintained control until the military coup of 1973 that allowed Augusto Pinochet to come to power. The new U.S.-backed junta suspended the Constitution and the Congress for complete control. It imposed censorship and curfew and banned all leftist parties and political activity. Eventually, Pinochet wrote a new constitution, justifying his rule and giving large amounts of power to the president. The government also instituted free market reforms to help Chile's tanking economy. Although the economy began to grow, the lower classes had less government support and less labor laws to protect wages. Pinochet's regime is widely known for its human rights abuses. Several reports conclude that 2,000 people were killed, 30,000 tortured, and 20,000 left Chile in exile. During Pinochet's reign, there were several assassination attempts by pro-Soviet forces. Soviet weapons entering Chile were once intercepted. Also, Pinochet's bulletproof Mercedes was once hit by a rocket launcher. New elections were held fairly in 1980, and Patricio Aylwin won 60% of the popular vote. The new president changed the constitution to moderate the power of government. The common pattern that we see here is that the poor in Latin America at this time would push for socialist reforms. However, whenever the U.S. would so much as hear the word communism, it would attempt to destroy it. In both cases, the CIA would fund candidates it liked and attempt to assassinate those it didn't, or impose sanctions in order to at least lessen the power of these rulers. In these ways, the U.S. has been able to maintain control far beyond its borders.